Alright guys, Murph's here. And today I want to talk about the 10mm cartridge. I want to talk about some of its history as well as some of my opinions as to its applicability for different uses. Now, history-wise, the 10mm cartridge came out in 1983 and was the brainchild of Colonel Jeff Cooper. He developed this cartridge with the intent to design the ultimate fighting handgun cartridge. So what he did was he introduced a 40 caliber bullet in a 200 grain loading that moved 1,200 feet per second and generated 635 foot-pounds of energy. Now that's fairly significant. That is in excess of some 357 Magnum loadings. It's actually, with some of the things that were found, some of the hand loads that were done with this cartridge, we've gotten well into 41 Magnum territory. And that is definitely very potent. However, there are a couple of issues with the initial startup. Now, I talked about some general issues with new cartridge introduction in my 357 SIG video that I did last week, which if you haven't checked that out, I'll throw the link in the description. And the 10mm was definitely not immune to these issues, even though they came from a titan in the gun community. Now, the first pistol that came out for this cartridge was the Bren 10, which was more or less a beefed up version of the CZ75, which was another favorite of Colonel Jeff Cooper. And the issue was not only was the ammunition, new and expensive, but so was the handgun. And even though they tried to get some exposure in like Miami Vice and stuff like that, sales were not doing very well. The Bren 10 was quite expensive and actually not that great of a handgun. Now, along this timeline, the Colt Delta Elite would come out, chambered in the 10mm cartridge, and that would generate some interest in the loading because, well, the Colt firearm was a little more affordable, and then also in the 1911 platform coming from Colt, that held sway at the time. But the 10mm cartridge doesn't really get a boost up until the 1986 Miami-Dade shootout, where I've talked about this previously in my 40 Smith & Wesson compromise video, which I can throw the link in the description if there's any interest in that. But it does stand to touch on it yet again. So 5 FBI agents decided to finally intercept, or finally had enough information to be able to intercept a duo of bank robbers and murderers. And they did a kind of pincer move attack where a couple of agents in a car used their vehicle in a pit maneuver against the bank robbers' car in order to try to immobilize their vehicle and also take the bank robbers out of the fight. However, that did not work, and both bank robbers responded with a high volume of fire, and 4 out of the 5 FBI agents in the process of the shootout wind up getting either injured or killed. Only one guy came out unscathed. And what was discovered in the investigation that ensued was that the FBI agents hit the suspects multiple times. However, the rounds did not produce fight-stopping characteristics within their bodies, so it wound up taking more rounds than what was expected to be able to subdue the attackers. And this was all entirely out of handguns. Out of the 5 guys, 1 guy showed up with a shotgun, which, in my own opinion, is a little egregious. Like, you knew you were getting into a fight. Why did you come in with a bunch of handguns and not a larger weapon system? But that's a discussion for another time. I'm not trying to nitpick these dudes, God rest their souls, and all that kind of stuff. I'm not trying to go down that path at the moment. But this caused quite a bit of outcry and an inevitable overcorrection from the government. So the FBI immediately launched into an investigation to decide what their new caliber is going to be, because 9mm, 38 plus speed, and apparently 357 Magnum were not successful enough cartridges in this case. So they do a lot of testing, and 10mm winds up coming out 100% on top. And actually, one of the agents present doing the testing brought in his own Colt Delta Elite to perform this testing, which is kind of interesting. So the 10mm comes out on top of the list, and the FBI moves to adopt it. They adopt a 170 grain loading, moving at about 1,350 feet per second. That's fast. That is really fast for that much mass. So almost immediately issues are identified with the wide adoption of the 10 millimeter across the FBI. And some law enforcement agencies also follow suit with the FBI because they are definitely trendsetters when it comes to adoption of different pieces of equipment and calibers, handguns, all that kind of stuff. The FBI adopts it with the Smith & Wesson 1076, which is a third generation Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol developed on the 4506. And a lot of people say that the issue was, well, the desk jockeys or the female FBI agents couldn't properly handle the cartridge. And I think that's not doing a lot of people justice here. Here's the issue. The 10 millimeter is a kind of long cartridge, which generally requires a thicker grip, be it in a single stack or a double stack, and it's definitely exhibited in the double stack issue, but you wind up with a larger overall grip dimension. So if you have somebody with smaller hands, be it a female or a shorter male, or just somebody with small hands to begin with, the 10 millimeter becomes a lot of handgun to hang on to, especially under rapid fire shot strings, which are indicative of handgun combat. So there hits a certain point when you're selecting cartridges and self-defense and all that kind of stuff where you kind of hit a paradox, right? Where I could have a really powerful cartridge, but if I can't hang on to it under rapid fire shot strings, then I can't necessarily ensure that I'm going to be able to win the fight by placing multiple accurate hits back to back under duress. So you've got to figure out where your trade-offs are, and the FBI ultimately decided that the 10 mil was too high on the powerful but not accurate enough scale for a wide selection of people, for a wide demographic of people who joined the FBI. So what they initially would do was download the cartridge to a 180 grain bullet moving at 950 feet per second, and they would call that the 10 millimeter light. That's not impressive. Ballistically, that's not impressive. I'm sure the cartridge performed just fine, but that is not impressive. And ultimately, what the FBI realized was that they had a lot of case capacity that was going unused. Why do they have such a large gun that is creating such an issue in smaller hand sizes? So what they wound up doing was eventually developing the 40 Smith & Wesson, and then that took off, and that's a whole separate video. Now, after the FBI dropped the 10 millimeter cartridge, the 10 millimeter cartridge almost became like Voldemort's Horcruxes. It was cast all throughout the gun community, but hiding in small places amongst hand loaders, or people who lived in the backwoods and needed a more potent cartridge, or guys who were really dead set on extremely powerful semi-automatic cartridges, whatever it may be. It was on the edge, it was on the fringe of the gun community. It was not mainstream by any means. And that's where it has resided for the most part until recently. Now, I know 12 years ago, I met a fella, and he and I were talking about gun stuff, and we eventually wound up being friends, but at the time, he was completely dead set on a Glock 21 short frame. And I myself, whenever I'm talking to people, I like to throw out competitive options to whatever it is that they're looking at, just because I like to expose people to new things. I like to present arguments, reasoned arguments to what it is that they are already doing, just to see if I can enlighten them further. Be it I show them something they didn't know before, or I help them embolden their argument for why it is that they choose what they choose. So he wanted a Glock 21 short frame because he had small fingers, and he wanted a 45 ACP. And I threw out the 10 millimeter cartridge just in passing. Hey, have you ever considered 10 millimeter? And initially, of course, he rejected it because he didn't really know a lot about it, but he started doing some side research. And at first, he was of the opinion that he wasn't too terribly interested in the 10 millimeter because he wanted a Glock and they didn't make it in a short frame. They didn't make their 10 millimeter Glock 20 in a short frame. But as luck or fate would have it, that very next month, they introduced the Glock 20 short frame, and that's what he wound up buying, because the 10mm has some very interesting ballistic capabilities in comparison to 45 ACP. Now, 10mm has had a bit of a resurrection lately, and I've had quite a few friends get into it, and I've really seen this explosion of it on the market. Explosion in comparison to what 10mm has been doing, of course. It's not like it's at 9mm levels. But the problem with currently loaded 10mm is a lot of the popular offerings on the market are not near what 10mm used to be. A lot of them are loading 40 Smith & Wesson grainage, so we're talking between 155 and 180 grain bullets, and they're moving between 900 and 1100 feet per second. That's fairly slow. That's actually not that different from 45 ACP plus P on the high end. On the high end, mind you. And 45 ACP is more available, and when times are normal, a little bit better priced. Even, and that dynamic gets a little weird in the plus P loads, so don't necessarily quote me on this, but you're not doing anything that differently than a 45 ACP, and there's definitely a ton of 45 ACP out on the market as opposed to 10 millimeter loadings. And that's even reflected in penetration and all that kind of stuff, which my favorite resource to use for these type of comparisons comes from LuckyGunner.com. I'm not supported by Lucky Gunner. I've just been using them for 4 years, ever since I first discovered their charts on different types of personal defense ammunition, and that's what I use to select all my personal defense ammo. So I'll throw the link in the description. I definitely suggest you guys check them out. They're a fantastic resource. If you want true 10 millimeter loadings on the modern market, you have to start looking at people like Buffalo Bore, Underwood Ammo, and like Corbon in order to be able to find those hot 10 millimeter loadings. So like Underwood Ammo has a 165 grain 10 millimeter hollow point moving at 1400 feet per second. That's amazing. That's what I want to see when I see 10 millimeter. Those are the numbers that I expect. Not this 10 millimeter light stuff that the FBI went to. If I want 10 mil, I want power. That's what I'm looking for. I think it was Buffalo Bore had a 180 grain bullet moving at 1300 feet per second ish. Don't quote me on it. I'm kind of working on the fringe of my memory right now. But in excess of 1200 feet per second. Excellent. Absolutely excellent. Excellent. That's what I want to see. That's 10 millimeter. That's the 10 millimeter I know and love. Now, what are good uses for 10 millimeter? Anytime you talk about 10 millimeter, you start to talk about some weird dynamics of self-defense type prospects. Now, a couple of years ago, actually probably in excess of 10 years ago, there was a self-defense shooting where a gentleman used a 10 millimeter handgun in his self-defense, and he wound up going to jail. And part of that, among many other things, part of that was because the opposing lawyer used the argument that he was using a cartridge more powerful than what the police use. So kind of like he was looking for a fight type of deal. And ultimately, that conviction got overturned and all that kind of stuff. But you'll hear a lot of people throw that out there as to why you shouldn't carry 10 millimeter. That's an argument that could be used. It's definitely something to pay attention to. But honestly, guys, when it comes to self-defense situations, if they decide to go the ammo route, they're going to go the ammo route. Or any series of arguments that they're going to use. That's a very tenuous reason for why you shouldn't carry a cartridge, because that almost becomes the reason for why you shouldn't carry a handgun. And that doesn't make any sense, not from a self-defense standpoint. So that's not the best way to go about why we shouldn't use 10 millimeter. Now, when it comes to 10 millimeter and true 10 millimeter loads, we start talking about like over-penetration type characteristics. That's maybe a reason you shouldn't use 10 millimeter in self-defense. Just throwing that out there. Unless you're up in Alaska, in which case some of these Underwood Ammo and Corbon or Buffalo Bore offerings would be great bear medicine. Or you're in a place in general that has a bear issue. 10 millimeter becomes a really interesting option because a Glock 20 holds 15 rounds of it. That's a lot of 10 mil. You could really put a hurting on a bear very quickly with a high dosage of 10 millimeter, if you're in a situation where you might need to do so. Just throwing that out there. So home defense, maybe not your first choice. Bear defense, an excellent choice, honestly. I understand that it's very popular in Alaska still to use 10 millimeter for bear defense. And a hotly loaded 45 plus P could do something very comparable and be a little more available depending on where you are. But 10 millimeter consistently has more capacity. In a single stack magazine, it'll just have one additional round. In a double stack magazine, you're going to see 2 to 3 additional rounds. That's something going pretty good in the 10 millimeter's favor. Just throwing that out there. Now, I have some experience with the 10 millimeter. I have shot Glock 20s and some 1911s chambered in 10 millimeter, as well as a Glock 40, which of those three, I don't know. The 1911 is extremely fun in the 10 millimeter cartridge. However, What the Glocks have an advantage over the 1911s in the 10 millimeter comes to the original Glock frame for the Glock 20 and Glock 21 was built around the 10 millimeter cartridge, not the 45 ACP. And 1911s chambered in 10 millimeter have a tendency to take more abuse than perhaps Glock frames might. Just throwing that out there. And that's not exactly a hard, fast rule. It's kind of like an all-truism or a way to think about things. In general, you want guns designed for the 10 millimeter, especially if you're going to run those extremely hot loads through it. You're going to want something designed to take those pressures if you want any longevity in your handgun. So something to consider along with that. You're talking about some pretty steep chamber pressures in excess of 37,000 psi. So some things to throw out there. But, oh, one more thing I want to touch on before we go. 10 millimeters use as a hunting cartridge. I actually really like the idea of using the 10 millimeter as a hunting cartridge on small game, depending on how far it is that you're hunting. The shots would have to be really close for me to be really accepting of its use on like deer. I know a lot of guys use it on pigs, and I'm very interested by its use on pigs, but again, I think a lot of it comes down to distance when it comes to a humane kill on an animal, and it might be more applicable on smaller game. Now, another great use of the 10 millimeter, which has been more explored than some other cartridges that I've talked about, i.e. the 357 SIG, is its use in a submachine gun. Heckler & Koch, or Heckler & Koch, as I've been corrected, did produce a variant of the MP5 in the 10 millimeter. If you're feeling some of that Tom Clancy Rainbow Six vibe, that is super cool to me. I cannot even imagine firing off a burst of some really hot loaded 10 millimeter cartridges at somebody. That sounds absolutely fantastic. And a really great dynamic if I'm using a pistol caliber carbine. Now, the 10 millimeter has had some success in the current market when it comes to PCCs and what I refer to as 3 points of contact pistols. So things in your AR pistol type style guns. And it has definitely been used in the Chris Vector, which I wish that setup had a little bit longer barrel just to get more velocity out of the cartridge overall. That's one of the things that I like about the 3 points of contact pistols, to have a little bit longer barrel than I would commonly find in a handgun, so I can get more velocity out of a handgun cartridge and then get better downrange performance, a little bit longer performance, all that kind of stuff. But that's just my opinion. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts and opinions on the 10 millimeter cartridge. I hope you guys found this helpful, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.